The 1990s, fashionably anti-fashion. It was a more caring, optimistic decade, was the 90s. Remember these two, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher? Well, they seemed rather elderly. They were both right-wing, they were both capitalists, and in the 90s they were replaced by these two men, Bill Clinton, the President of the United States, on the left, and this is Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain. They were both more towards the left. They were young. They were the first boomer world leaders. I can prove they were boomers as well. That's Bill Clinton in the 60s, and that's Tony Blair in the 60s. So suddenly we felt that the world was being ruled by young people who were kind and understood us. We really wanted to draw a line under the 80s. We were all very embarrassed and ashamed. So we were out to save the planet, save the whales. We were shiny, happy people. That was the title of a hit song of the era. We wanted to be with our friends. All of our friends. The best way to understand the 90s is to realize that absolutely everything was basically a backlash to the 80s. Greed was not good, we decided, and glitz, glamour, excess, high fashion, and an obsession with wealth gave way to an equally strong obsession for things that were real. Natural hair, natural beauty, organic food, real coffee. Real women talking to real people about real problems. That's Oprah, of course. So famous in the 90s. This is when she rose to fame because she was so real, so genuine. It's when reality TV kicked in. The Real World was the first reality TV show. Real people on television. And sticking with television, my goodness, we loved real people. We didn't want to see glamorous people like the sort we saw in Dynasty and Dallas, these rich families. No, we wanted people like Roseanne. Nice, blue-collar, Midwestern, real folk. Loser comedy. That was a term coined in the 90s. For unglamorous characters living real lives with real problems. Beavis and Butthead. They were losers. They were hilarious on MTV. Loser comedy. Beck, who was a musician, even had a song called Loser. The line goes, I'm a loser, baby, so why don't you kill me? We took pride in being losers and being real and being down to earth. We were kind of embarrassed by the 80s, to be honest with you. And no wonder then that this guy, Homer Simpson, sort of became the totem for the decade. And our cultural hotspot of the era was a place that was very real. It wasn't all glitzy and glamorous like Miami. No! Seattle. Seattle was the cultural hotspot. Think about movies like Sleepless in Seattle. The hit TV sitcom of the 90s, Frasier, is set in Seattle. Starbucks comes from Seattle, and of course it was in the 90s that Starbucks mania kicked in. Grunge comes from Seattle, which of course takes us now. And this brings us to our obvious style icon of the era, Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of Nirvana, and that's Nirvana's little symbol. Nirvana were one of the grunge bands to explode out of Seattle in the early 90s. Nirvana were the most famous band, and really grunge, the whole grunge look was a reaction against all of the glamour of the music industry in the 80s, all of the makeup, all of the new romantic high fashion looks. Think about Boy George and the way he dressed, and then think about Kurt Cobain. Flannel shirts, plaid flannel shirts with t-shirts underneath. Short sleeve t-shirts over long sleeve t-shirts. Think about it, Seattle is cold. This is just what guys in Seattle wore to keep warm. But of course, you add the ripped jeans and the long hair, and suddenly it becomes a look. It becomes the grunge look. It was so cool. It was so different to the 80s. It was so real, and it was so easy to assimilate that everyone adopted a little grunge into their wardrobe. And it took no time, literally no time, for grunge to be embraced by fashion with a capital F. This is Marc Jacobs' famous 1993 Grunge Collection for Perry Ellis. So you see how quickly now runway is grabbing street. Kurt Cobain shot his head off with a gun. Suicide, very sad, seemed like a nice guy. Let's look at the 1990s body ideal. Skinny, clavicle. Do you know what clavicle means? It means your chest sinks in. With scrawny shoulders, rib cage showing, hip bones sticking out. Oh, this was real. But of course it was the perfect body for this kind of grungy chic of the 90s. Did anyone really have a body like this? Well, of course they did. Kate Moss had this kind of body. Courtney Love had this kind of body. This was the perfect anti-fashion body. And yet, there was another ideal of the 90s that was so perfect and magnificent, the opposite to this body ideal, in fact, that very few people could even hope to achieve it. The supermodel body. There they are, the supermodels. All of them collected. You know about the supermodels, right? I won't list them all, but there they are. Claudia Schiffer, Naomi Campbell, they're all there. They were a phenomenon, they were a talking point, and they were so exquisite and so beautiful and so perfect, we couldn't even hope to aspire to the supermodels. We could just look at them. There was a fashion trend that really went with the whole Kate Moss, grunge, Courtney Love thing, called heroin chic. There it is. Believe it or not, that is a high fashion image. The idea behind heroin chic was to look like you had been up all night injecting yourself with heroin. Some more fashion images of heroin chic. Unbelievably, we thought this was cool. Heroin is not cool, but heroin chic, ooh, everybody liked that. Kate Moss, of course, was the poster girl for heroin chic. But here is Courtney Love. Courtney Love, you know, was married to, were they married or were they just together? They had a child together, Kurt Cobain. She was the grunge lead singer of the all-girl rock band Hole. And look, there she is in an ad campaign for Yves Saint Laurent. So it really shows you, doesn't it, that this grunge look really was considered high fashion. I look at it now and I think it's horrible. What about you? But if Sarah wants the look, let's give it to her. First of all, let's remember, natural beauty was the beauty look, really, of the 90s. But for high fashion girls, let's give her the heroin chic look. First of all, a lot of smudgy makeup running down your face. Kind of an effect to make it look like you have black eyes. In fact, a dark red lip, smudged lipstick, lank, greasy hair, and voila, heroin chic. But there was a far more fun side to the naughty 90s than heroin chic. Rave culture, for example. I'm not a fan of techno music, but many people were in the 90s. And here is some rave attire. It was fun, it was colourful, lots of pink, lots of yellow. I think people probably did a lot of drugs. We don't like that. We don't approve of drugs. But clothing-wise, this was a lot more colourful than heroin chic. There was the great 70s revival when the 70s were rediscovered with flares and wide ties and colour, but this was very edgy, a very ironic and trendy revisit to the 70s. And of course, Britpop. This was a musical movement that came out of Britain, and it really drew on the 1960s. Bands like Oasis, you may have heard of them, and Blur, you may not have heard of them, but they were big Britpop bands. And Britpop style and fashion really paid a homage to mod culture of the 60s. A lot of primary colours, Fred Perry, this kind of thing. And come on, I've thought of another Britpop, or at least British export of the 90s that I'm sure you guys all know. Spice up your life with a bit of Spice Girls. But in terms of fashion, high fashion, runway starts to disconnect from clothing. And it starts to become something else. It starts turning into conceptual art. Everyone talks about Alexander McQueen. He was a genius. He was beautiful. He was an artist, though. So much of what he did became increasingly unwearable that it made no sense to real-life retail. It was something to look at in a museum. Conceptual art can be very difficult to wear. I think this is Yamamoto again. Nobody's going to wear that. So tried and tested luxury labels like Gucci, Chanel, and Dior made more sense to people. But even Dior in this era under John Galliano, it was gorgeous, but who on earth is going to wear that kind of stuff? We've seen a lot of it actually in this course, looking at our historic costume. Yes, Galliano for Dior was beautiful, but who actually wants to walk around looking like an 18th century courtier? So, Chanel, Gucci, Givenchy, these were the labels that people who could afford to buy ready-to-wear designer clothing opted for, yet most people couldn't afford to buy outfits from these labels. So more affordable elements of luxury high fashion, handbags particularly, became possibly the only element of runway to filter down into the real world. From this point onwards, all of the designers that are around today were around in the 90s with one or two exceptions only. So apart from those one or two exceptions, next time I'm not going to talk about designers. So in a decade obsessed with being real, what did the real world wear? If you weren't rich enough for a runway, not hip enough for Britpop, not thin enough for Heroin Chic, what were you left with in the 90s? This.